Army Scouts versus Kiowa and Comanche warriors. In the heart of the plains, the year was 1874, and the northern plains of Texas were at the epicenter of one of the most intense and bloody conflicts between the United States Army and the Native American tribes of the southern plains. Among the various tribes that had been pushing back against U.S. expansion, the Kiowa and Comanche were considered to be among the fiercest and most formidable opponents. Their ability to execute complex guerrilla tactics and their unrivaled horsemanship made them nearly invincible on the open plains, a fact that American soldiers had come to dread. The story begins on September 12, 1874, when a small group of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers found themselves isolated in the open plains of northern Texas, caught in a deadly crossfire. The warriors they faced were not just any ordinary group. They were Kiowa and Comanche, numbering over 100. This was no random attack, but rather a calculated strike as part of the larger conflict known as the Red River War, which would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the Southern Plains Resistance. The soldiers and scouts, a legendary group of men, the small 6-man detachment that was about to face the fury of the Kiowa and Comanche, was led by Sergeant Woodhull with Privates Rath, Harrington, and Smith. Alongside them were two scouts, Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon. While the others may not have had the same level of notoriety as Dixon, it was this man who would become a legend of the frontier and whose survival during this encounter would be remembered for years to come. Billy Dixon at this point was already a recognized name. Only months earlier, at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, Dixon had earned widespread acclaim for a remarkable shot from nearly half a mile away. Dixon had shot and killed a Comanche chief, turning the tide of that battle. It was believed that this shot not only saved his comrades, but helped stem the tide of Comanche attacks against the settlers in the region. Now, however, Dixon was facing an entirely different enemy on the open plains, where his marksmanship would not be the defining factor. The scouts, including Dixon and Chapman, had been tasked with carrying dispatches concerning the delay of supplies to Colonel Nelson A. Miles's camp. This delay, which had been caused by ongoing Kiowa and Comanche raids, had become a serious problem. The supply train led by Captain Willis Lyman had been ambushed repeatedly, forcing the soldiers to send this small detachment to investigate and deliver critical communications. Little did they know that their mission would soon turn into a fight for survival. The Kiowa and Comanche were no strangers to fighting for survival either. They had been forced to defend their homelands against the encroachment of settlers in the U.S. government, leading to a series of brutal engagements. By 1874, their resistance had become increasingly desperate, and they would stop at nothing to protect their way of life. The opening attack. As the scouts and soldiers traveled across the plains, they were unaware that they were being closely observed by a large number of Kiowa and Comanche warriors. These tribes were notorious for their ability to track and surprise their enemies, and this particular group of warriors had already anticipated the Army's movements. The first sign that the scouts and soldiers had been discovered came when a sudden hail of bullets and arrows rained down upon them, caught in the open. With no cover or shelter to shield them from the oncoming storm of weapons, the soldiers quickly realized that they were in grave danger. The warriors, skilled in their craft, knew that their target was vulnerable and would not stand a chance without the aid of reinforcements. The Kiowa and Comanche tactics were swift and precise, creating a whirlwind of chaos that few could survive. Dixon and his men quickly scrambled to defend themselves, but the odds were against them. As the attack unfolded, the first casualty was Private George Smith, whose task had been to hold the horses, preventing them from fleeing in the midst of the battle. Tragically, Smith was struck by a bullet that pierced one of his lungs, sending him to the ground in agony. His death, however, was not the only tragedy of the day. The horses, now freed from their handlers, scattered across the plains, carrying with them the soldiers' supplies, ammunition, blankets, water, canteens, and other necessities. This loss would leave the men stranded, their survival depending solely on their ability to hold off the attackers with the few resources they had left. The brutality of the Kiowa and Comanche tactics. The Kiowa and Comanche warriors, seeing that their enemies were now exposed and in disarray, began to circle around the scouts and soldiers, taking their time unlike the U.S. Army, which was trained in formal warfare. The native warriors were masters of guerrilla tactics. They fought in fluid, fast-moving groups that appeared and disappeared like shadows across the vast plains. Their horse riding skills were unparalleled, and they could unleash arrows at an astonishing rate, often riding in and out of battle before the soldiers could even react. Billy Dixon, despite his exceptional experience in frontier warfare, found himself struggling to adapt to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the battle. The soldiers had been trained to fight in formations, but against this enemy such strategies were useless. The Kiowa and Comanche did not engage in linear battles. They used their mobility to outflank and harass their opponents, forcing them into constant retreat. While the U.S. Army had experience in organized warfare, their recent involvement in the American Civil War had not prepared them for this type of conflict. The Southern Plains tribes were not bound by traditional military structures and were not confined to rigid formations. Instead, they used the terrain and their superior knowledge of the land to outwit and outmaneuver their opponents. As the battle wore on, the Kiowa and Comanche warriors used their superior mobility and knowledge of the terrain to pick off their targets one by one. Their aim was not necessarily to kill the soldiers outright, but to break their spirit and exhaust their resources. For the warriors, this was about more than just survival. It was about sending a message to the U.S. Army that they would not back down. The struggle for survival in the Buffalo Wallow, with the situation becoming increasingly dire, Dixon and his comrades realized that they had to make a move or face certain death in the distance. Dixon spotted a small depression in the ground, a buffalo wallow. These natural depressions, created by buffalo herds as they wallowed in the dirt, were not ideal places to take shelter, but they offered better protection than remaining exposed on the open plain. Dixon quickly made the decision to lead his comrades to the buffalo wallow, hoping that it might provide enough cover to make a stand. Despite the withering fire from the Kiowa and Comanche, Dixon dashed to the wallow, where he quickly assessed its potential. It was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Shallow but better than nothing, he shouted to his comrades, urging them to follow his lead. Once the men had gathered at the buffalo wallow, they began to dig frantically, using their hands and knives to create a defensive barrier around them. Every movement was accompanied by the sounds of gunfire and arrows, but the men pushed forward, determined to hold their ground. The Kiowa and Comanche warriors, seeing the soldiers taking cover, intensified their attacks, hoping to wear down the defenders and force them into surrender. As the hours passed, the situation became more desperate. The soldiers and scouts, many of whom were already wounded, continued to fight with whatever strength they had left. Dixon's account of the battle speaks to the resilience and bravery of the men involved. Despite their injuries, none of them faltered or complained. Their determination to survive, fueled by the knowledge that capture would mean a gruesome and violent death, kept them fighting. The psychological toll of the battle also became evident. Dixon recalls a moment when one of his comrades, overcome by despair, shouted that there was no use in continuing the fight. But just as the man resigned himself to defeat, a bullet struck the ground near him, filling his mouth with dirt. The incident, though grim, had a strange effect. Dixon, despite the horror of the situation, couldn't help but laugh, though it was a nervous, hollow laugh. It was a rare moment of dark humor. In an otherwise bleak and unforgiving environment, Amos Chapman's injury and the attempt to save him. As the battle raged on, the men grew more desperate. One of their own, Amos Chapman, had been struck by a bullet and was badly injured. His leg was shattered and he was unable to move. Dixon, who was already wounded in the calf, made several attempts to reach Chapman and carry him to the buffalo wallow. Each time he tried to make the dash, the Kiowa and Comanche warriors would fire upon him, forcing him to retreat, but Dixon refused to give up. Finally, after several failed attempts, he was able to reach Chapman, and with great effort he carried his injured comrade to the relative safety of the buffalo wallow. Despite the difficulty of carrying a larger man, Dixon's determination and strength allowed him to get Chapman to safety. This act of heroism, which demonstrated Dixon's unyielding courage, was not without its challenges. The Kiowa and Comanche continued their relentless attacks, attempting to overwhelm the men and push them into submission. But Dixon and his comrades refused to give in. They dug and fought with everything they had, determined to survive the storm in the final stand. As the day wore on, the temperature rose, and the men began to feel the strain of the battle. The heat combined with the constant barrage of attacks wore down their resolve, but just when it seemed that the situation could not get any worse, the weather changed abruptly. A storm rolled in from the north, bringing with it a torrential downpour. The rain soaked the soldiers to the bone and turned the buffalo Wallow into a murky pit of mud, blood and sweat. But the storm had a peculiar effect on the Kiowa and Comanche. The warriors, accustomed to harsh conditions, did not retreat, but they did stop attacking for a time, perhaps waiting for the storm to pass. This brief respite gave the men in the buffalo Wallow a moment to regroup, but it also presented new challenges. They had no shelter from the cold and were left exposed to the elements. The storm, while offering some temporary relief from the constant barrage of gunfire, also served to further strain the men's already fragile spirits. The search for help and the final rescue. As the storm raged on, the soldiers faced the grim reality that they might not survive the night, with their ammunition running low and their strength waning. Dixon decided to make a desperate attempt to find help. Private Rath, the most physically capable of the men, had already tried and failed to locate a trail leading back to camp. It was now Dixon's turn to navigate the treacherous terrain and try to find reinforcements. Under the cover of darkness, Dixon set out across the plains, moving as quickly and quietly as he could manage. His heart raced, and his mind swam with thoughts of what might happen. If he failed, he knew that if he was caught, he would likely meet a gruesome end. Yet somehow, Dixon managed to find a troop of soldiers who had been sent out on a search and rescue mission. They were able to make their way back to the buffalo Wallow and assist the wounded men, including Chapman, who would eventually lose his leg. The rescue came just in time. The survivors of the battle, including Dixon, Rath, and Harrington, were able to make their way back to safety. Yet the toll of the battle was clear. Private George Smith, who had been left behind, would not be coming back. His body was later recovered. But the man who had been a part of this harrowing fight would be remembered as a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice. The legacy of the Buffalo Wallow fight. The Buffalo Wallow fight became one of the defining moments of the Red River War. The bravery of the soldiers and scouts, particularly Billy Dixon, became legendary, but the toll of the battle was undeniable. The war would continue for months after this battle, but it marked a critical moment in the fight for the Southern Plains. The Kiowa and Comanche would continue their resistance, but in the end, their way of life would be irrevocably changed. The aftermath of the Buffalo Wallow fight was not just about the soldiers and their recognition. It was about the larger implications of the Red River War. The Kiowa, Comanche, and other tribes who had fought so fiercely were slowly losing the battle for their homeland, not through lack of effort, but because of the overwhelming might of the U.S. Army. The expansion of the United States, combined with the devastating effects of forced relocation and the destruction of the buffalo herds, meant that the tribes were losing their ability to resist. The ultimate victory of the U.S. Army in this conflict did not come without a cost. The emotional scars left on the soldiers who fought, the tribes who resisted, and the land itself would be felt for generations to come. For the soldiers, the recognition they received for their bravery, medals of honor and commendation, would never fully erase the horror of what they had endured. And for the Native American tribes, the Red River War would be a pivotal chapter in the long history of their fight for survival.